Hello and welcome to this session. My name is Susanne Piotrowski and we are going off to Paris right now. If you have a question, please write it into the chat. There will be a Q&A at the end. After Halifax and Margaret Wheaton and Lister spent more time in Paris than in any other place. All in all, she lived there 1,394 days of her life. Nearly 4 years. I will focus on the years 1819 to 1831. She had several reasons to go, which changed over the days and years. Just seeing the city for sightseeing, learning the language to be able to study there, attending lectures or taking lessons, finding a cure for her venereal disease, getting into higher society, maybe finding a companion for life. She had heard about it many times from the Norcliffes, who went there often, and reading books written by Georges Cuvier, father of the comparative anatomy, started her to think about going there herself. In 1817, she wrote, quote, "And finding as we walked that Mrs. Veitch would really like a trip to Paris, my aunt and I had some serious conversations about it just before supper. We have indeed talked of it many times before now." And in August 1818, he was speaking of the immense collection of stiffed enamels at Paris, which he had seen. I said, "I should like exceedingly to see Cuvier. Is that the name of some large animal?" In 1819, they started to plan their trip. Quote, "To set off to Paris on the 12th next month." 1819, sightseeing. In May 1819, she visited Paris for the first time. 16 days full of sightseeing. If you look in the travel guides of the time, you can see that she had read them thoroughly. Nearly everything obvious in and around Paris was seen by the two aunts. There was no need to care much about, like buying food. They took their meals in the hotel or at a restaurateur, only shopping for fun, talking to people about her wanting to come back in 1820. Quote, "I told him, Mr. Guillot, my wish to acquire the language and to study here. And a couple of days later, said I should hope to return to Paris next spring." One must keep in mind that at that time, Anne had no income of her own. So a journey with her aunt was one thing. Living for a couple of months in Paris depended on getting money from her uncle and aunt another. After her return, she very seriously thought of her plan, and she wrote a letter of 96 pages to Mr. Duffin about all she had seen in 1819. Quote, "After Miss March went serious conversations about going abroad with them, with Mr. Duffin, a 2-month tour in the autumn, mentioned my scheme of studying 6 months in Paris. And in August 1820, talking about my going to Paris in October. I had given up the thought some time ago, but now I begin to think of it again. It seems now or never, and may do me good." 1822. Disaster. The next time she got to Paris wasn't a very pleasant time. Her father and Marianne accompanied her because her father had not much money left, and it was decided to settle him and Marianne in Paris because it was cheaper to live there. Anne planned everything and inquired about a pension where her father and sister could stay. Quote, "And recommended number 24 Place Vendôme, an excellent comme il faut pension kept by a Madame Boff, a Swiss. Later, Anne will live there." But her father didn't like the idea, and he made a remark before they set over to France that gave the tone for this journey. Quote, "There was always a knife and he could cut her throat." We don't know what really happened because Anne removed the pages of her diary for these days. You can see here the gap between pages 104 and 119. She must have been very annoyed and didn't want it to be reminded of it, or maybe she didn't want anybody to be able to read it. At the day they left Paris, she wrote, How glad shall I be when this journey is over? 'Tis well, I have met none I know all the while I was walking with my father this morning. I was muttering to myself at his vulgarity, conspicuous on all occasions. To get back to Paris again would take some time, but it was a constant thought in her mind. Quote, told her aunt, I was poorly and low about the discharge and thought grapes and pears of Paris did me more good than anything. Well, said she, perhaps if we live, you may go next year. And in February 1824, I begin to think I may get to Paris in the autumn. And in May 1824, my aunt and I began to talk more seriously of my going to Paris this autumn, and it was slightly mentioned to my uncle this morning. Of course, it had to be mentioned to her uncle, because like in 1819, with no income of her own, she needed her uncle and aunt to finance the time in Paris. In August 1824, she said I was to spend a couple of months with some friends in Paris. 1824-25, sightseeing, sex, language, and Mercury. Again, dependent on the money of her aunt and uncle, it was decided that there would be money for 3 months in Paris. Living in the pension at Place Vendôme again meant that there was no need to care about domestic things, except wood for the fireplace. Marlene, backwards, please. Yeah. The meals were taken and buying food was only one forward. Marlene? Yeah, that's the one. The meals were taken there and buying food was only buying some fruits or pastry. All other things would be done by the pension or accordingly. Now she started seriously to learn French and Italian, as it was essential for her to attend lectures. Madame Galvani not only became her teacher of the language and customs, but also a friend who often helped with writing official letters or bargaining to get apartments or other things much cheaper. Seeking a cure for her venereal disease wasn't mentioned in the first month. Sightseeing and socializing with the other guests were the main occupations. Especially Mademoiselle de Sons and Mrs. Catherine Maria Barlow, a widow with a 13-year-old daughter, interested Anne. About 1.5 months after Anne's arrival, the friendship with Mrs. Barlow deepened and they eventually became lovers. Nearly every entry at that time is in crypthand. Anne neglected sightseeing and, more important, translation exercises for her lesson with Madame Galvani, so that she often was unprepared and they could only have conversations. Quote, spent the whole time in conversation, having done nothing more of my translations from the Italian. And also thinking seriously about whom she should prefer, Mariana or Mrs. Barlow, disturbed her study in Paris scheme. Quote, she loves me and I love her now, and have more than once before last night contrasted her conduct with peace, much to Mrs. Barlow's advantage. And just at this time, she started to visit a doctor, Monsieur Guillaume Duprétrin, the personal doctor of the king, who recommended a treatment with mercury and hot bath. Marionda wondered, and so do I, why Anne started so late. The treatment wasn't very successful, so she started with a solution she had to inject into her vagina. Next. At the end of 1824, there was a conflict between Madame de Boiff and Mrs. Barlow about the latter's conduct. Maria and Anne decided to leave and live in an apartment at number 15 Key Voltaire. This, of course, meant more freedom, especially for their sexual activities. The only persons who could disturb them were the servants and Mrs. Barlow's daughter, who visited at the weekends. But it also meant ongoing neglect of learning more French. Another distraction was Anne's dilemma to decide if she should take Maria as her companion or still wait for when Charles dies. And she had to visit Monsieur Dupuytren, take her injections, and visit the Bain Vigier. Now, a short intermezzo. This picture of the building of number 15, Key Voltaire, you can see here, and which I really started to love, unfortunately shows the wrong building. This one you can see here is from 1894, so it isn't the one Maria and Anne lived in. In fact, I just learned 5 weeks ago. Next. Next slide, Berlin. In this anonymous and undated drawing, you can see Key Voltaire after 1791. And I guess one of the buildings on the left is number 15. The next picture shows the view from Key Voltaire to the Louvre. And you can also see Bain Vigier, this is this boat near the bridge, where Anne took her hot bath. And of course, there was sightseeing, not only the usual sites, but also places like the Chambre des Députés. In March 1825, it was time for Anne to go back to England. She couldn't ask her uncle and aunt again for money as she did before. Quote, "I leave Paris," said I to myself, "with sentiments how different from those with which I arrived. My eye was accustomed to all it saw. It was no longer a stranger, nor thought as before, with all that differed from that it left at home. Imperfectly as I speak the language, I felt almost at home in Paris and seemed to feel so in France. I thought over my whole acquaintance with Mrs. Barlow. I was sorry to leave her, but yet somehow my sorrow was not so deep as I expected." Now, 2 important things happened till she came back to Paris in 1826. There was a reunion with Mariana, and in January 1826, Uncle James Lister died. So now, when she and her aunt, and for a couple of weeks Mariana, came back to Paris, they had 2/3 of the income of the Shipton estate and no one to ask for money. 1826 to 28, sorting things, sex, and science. At the beginning of this day, she and Mariana did a lot of sightseeing, and they looked for an apartment. A week after their arrival, they moved into number 6 Rue Mondovie. Now, there were more domestic tasks for Anne she had to manage. With servants not able to speak French, she was the one to find shops and buy things like meat, milk, fruits, bread, wine. And as you can see here, she started an address book for the best merchants. And here you can see just an example of shopping tours. And the picture shows the Passage de Panorama, very often visited by Anne. She often went there not only because there was the best patisserie in Paris. She visited Mrs. Barlow at Key Voltaire, who wasn't happy about Anne's bringing Mariana to Paris, which Anne had never mentioned in the letters to Mrs. Barlow. It caused several scenes, and Anne seemed to be contented if they all behaved well. Quote, said Mariana, "Mrs. Barlow." There was Jane too. Mrs. Barlow, pale as death. I felt little less so, jumped out of the carriage, met her. In crossing the Tuileries Gardens, mentioned Mariana's being with us. Mrs. Barlow agitated, said I had behaved dishonestly not to tell her before. Second quote, then said Mrs. Barlow, "You love her," another, "and you tell me so yourself. I did not think you could have so soon forgotten me and met me thus," etc., etc. And we had a scene at last. I said, I durst not presume to talk of love without her express permission under my present circumstances, which could not be changed. Not a very good start for her study scheme. She is on sightseeing tours with Mariana and trying to get a more manageable Mrs. Barlow. And not long after Marianne's leaving Paris, against all she said to Maria about waiting for Marianne, next slide, please, started or renewed the sexual relationship with Maria, and she was a regular guest in Mrs. Barlow's apartment. And she and her aunt moved to a new apartment again. And this building you can see here is number 2 Place de la Madeleine. Besides sightseeing tours, she started a kind of walking routines. In a nearly artistic scheme, she walked almost every day the same way, beginning in 1827 with a walk to the Barrière de l'Étoile, a place you probably know if you have been in Paris yourself. Just now the Barrière is gone and the Arc de Triomphe is the main site there. In May 1827, she started to visit lectures of a Monsieur Trémery at the Institut de France on natural physics or natural philosophy. It is the first time she attended a lecture in French, and maybe that was an encouragement for things to come. The studies were interrupted by her journey to Italy with Mrs. Barlow and Jane, and you can hear more about this tour tomorrow at the Going to Italy session. But when back in Paris, she didn't mention the lectures anymore. Instead, she starts to complain about her bowels very much and blames the apartment. So she went for a couple of weeks to live at Madame de Rosny's, an acquaintance of Mrs. Barlow, much to the annoyance of Mrs. Barlow, who was becoming jealous again because Anne tried her best to seduce Madame de Rosny and enjoyed some grumblings with her. And she visited her aunt at Place de la Madeleine. In March 1828, she left Paris again to go to England and on a tour in Scotland with Sabella Maclean, who introduced her to Lady Stuart and Verhobert, something that changed her life in Paris very much. 1829 to 31, Society, Science and Dissections. She and her aunt moved into another apartment in Rue Godot de Mauroy, number 39. Immediately after coming back to Paris in April 1829, she went to the Jardin des Plantes, to the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, to see which lectures she could attend. There were lectures in botany, zoology, anatomy, comparative anatomy and physiology, plant physiology, chemistry, pharmacy, and others. And finally, in December, she was able to attend the lectures of Georges Cuvier at the Collège de France, and from time to time, his weekly soirée at his house. During the lectures, she took notes, and you can see here the book she used when she listened to Monsieur Cuvier. At the beginning of 1830, she was introduced to a medical student, Monsieur Julliat, who gave her private lessons in anatomy and dissecting. First animals, later human body parts, and 3 male babies. Quote, above half hour after he went, washing and cleaning the little fetus, etc. The first time of ever doing such a thing or ever handling my obier so heartedly. Perhaps the disgust will wear off in time, and I shall really get to dissect. To have more space for her studies, books, a skeleton, and especially the dissections, she rented a second apartment in Paris near the Jardin des Plantes in Rue Saint-Victor. You can see the street here on the picture. First number 7, later number 27. In her diary, she calls it her little apartment, which she kept till her death. And now she did things she would have never done at Shipton, like dusting, sweeping, cleaning, and even painting her bookshelves. It was so unusual that in the beginning, she wrote about it in crypt hand. In 1830, her gaining knowledge scheme exploded. At times, she visited week after week 20 lectures and took lessons with Monsieur Julliat, Monsieur Pelletier from the École des Mains in mineralogy, and continued her lessons with Madame Galvani in French and Italian. On top, she bought lots of new books to read even more about all these signs. In 1831, just a couple of weeks before her return to England, she even met Alexander von Humboldt, who lived in Paris in the early 1830s at Cuvier's house. And she made plans to continue her lessons and lectures in 1832. Having been introduced to Lady Stuart and Vere Hobart, who both stayed at the British Embassy in Paris with their relatives when Anne came back to Paris, changed her social life considerably. These relatives were no less than the British ambassador, Charles Stuart de Rothsay, his wife, and their two daughters, who were in their teens. Through this connection, she was introduced to many other people of the higher society. People she not only met in Paris, but who became travel companions and be a useful help in other parts of Europe, like the De Hagemans in Copenhagen. Visits were paid, and she often got invitations to dinners or balls. And as much as she enjoyed these events, she was always very uncertain if she dressed and behaved appropriate. She often wrote that she had to learn how to act in these circles. And when the people invited her again, shook hands and were civil, her world was very fine again. She did several things to get into higher society. For example, inviting the son of the De Hagemans to spend the Sundays with her. Quote, "A great nuisance to have children and choose sides, but what can I do to get into society with no family or connections and so small a fortune?" And her wish for a higher rank was enormously. Quote, "Have thought often lately if I could get a nobleman on my own terms, that is, never to attempt any particular connection together. I would for the sake of rank, and yet would all this rank make me really happier? I have no name or rank now. I should like to have both." Not long after coming back, she went on a journey with Lady Stuart and Vere Hobart to Belgium, Aachen, and along the Rhine, during which Anne started or continued to flirt with the latter, telling herself and her friends that she had motherly feelings for Vere. And when it was time to be away from Paris in August and September 1830, Lady Stuart de Rothsay accompanied her on her journey to the Pyrenees. Quote, "Going into the country to avoid the disagreeableness of Paris in August and September." During this time, the July Revolution took place in Paris. And Anne was the whole time in Paris and destabilized the political situation in France. And political events in England caused the dismissal of Lord Stuart de Rothsay as British ambassador. But there was an event that really made her feel very low for a long time. In November 1830, her friend and lover Sabella Maclean died, and had hoped for a long time that Sabella could come to her to Paris for some time. Quote, "Poor dear Sabella, I have lost the ostensible, and now I find the real object I cared to wait for her. And I confess I have felt more than usually unsettled since my last return." There will be a session tomorrow about Sabella Maclean. She went on with her lectures and dissections, noticed the events that followed the July Revolution, like the revolt in February 1831, tried to get introduced to the wife of the new ambassador, Lady Granville, and had a new walking routine to the Bois de Boulogne. It was a little bit Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde, dissecting in the afternoon, attending a ball in the evening. In 1830, she and her aunt started to talk about getting back to Shipton to settle her aunt there, and for herself to go back to Paris after maybe a couple of months. The reasons to go were, quote, "the uncertainty of continental politics, the it would seem declining state of my father's health, and the hope that now Shipton, even in winter, would do as well for my aunt as here, were the three considerations which had determined us." When they finally decided to go back, Anne's little apartment at number 7 was too tiny to put all the things into it that she wanted to store in Paris for her return. And so she found a bigger one at number 27, Rue Saint-Victor. On the 23rd of May, 1831, they left Paris, her aunt forever, and for a longer time than she thought at this moment. Quote, "My aunt felt a little low on leaving Paris. To me, the thought of a probably speedy return made it nothing." And then, before she left, she spoke to Monsieur Julliard, quote, "Then talked of doing as well as we could next winter if I was here, which counted upon being." And when in Paris in 1833, on her way to Germany and Copenhagen, quote, "Monsieur Julliard came at 4 to quarter hour. Said I was going to Denmark, hoped to do something again with the study on my return." She only returned to Paris in 1834 and 38. So did she get what she wanted? About the venereal disease, she mentioned it less and less, but if that was because of the treatment or time isn't known. She didn't succeed in finding a companion for life in Paris. Mrs. Barlow wasn't the right person, it seems. After the journey to Italy, it was clear for Anne that there was no chance for her. Getting into higher society. Through the contacts to the British Embassy, she became friends with some people of the high society, but to marry into it, of course, wasn't possible. Gaining knowledge. Alexander von Humboldt said about his time in Paris, "I chose Paris as my home because at that time, no place on the continent offered an equally accessible treasure trove of scientific support as well as great and active researchers." Anne was at the right time, in the right place for her want of gaining knowledge. And she used this opportunity very well. The amount of scientists she met and of lectures she attended was the best way for her to get what she wanted. So thank you for listening. If you like to contact me, you can see my addresses here. All black and white pictures are by Charles Malville. If you want to see more, you can find them on the homepage of the Musée Canaveral. Thanks to Marlene and Jess, my tech and CSC team, and to Kerstin for translating the Humboldt quote and checking my English. And now I'm going to look if there are questions. So there is, the question was, transcribing her French difficult if you don't already know French? Yes, it was. But fortunately, she didn't wrote very much in French. That was very fortunately. In your opinion, did Anne prefer Shipton or Paris, or did it change at different times? Sometimes I got the impression that she loved Shipton more when she was in Paris, and Paris more when she was at Shipton. So I think she loved both places very much. How difficult was it for ladies to attend science lectures at the Natural History Museum and Institut de France? Did it require special permission, or with uncommon, was it considered a legitimate occupation? There were other ladies who attended lectures, and these lectures at the museum and at the Collège de France and the Institut de France were free for everybody to attend. How did the July Revolution impact her studies or anything else? We probably don't have time for any. Okay. The suggestion is to take the quotes into the water closet, as we have to end the session now. And I think that's what we're going to do. So thank you very much. If you have questions, you will find me in the water closet.